You've heard of haunted houses, but what about haunted history itself? Welcome to Spookology, the podcast where your hosts, Keek and Cardi, unearth history's weirdest haunts, crimes, and cursed corners. From medieval murder mysteries and sinister seances to abandoned asylums and folklore with a vengeance, they cover it all with a shovel in one hand and sarcasm in the other. They're snarky, they're scholarly, they're slightly possessed. Whether you're a history nerd with a dark side, a ghost enthusiast with a love of footnotes, or just someone who likes your crime served with a side of cursed energy, Spookology is the podcast you didn't know you were dying for. New episodes drop regularly wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in if you dare, but don't worry, the ghosts are mostly friendly. Probably.
Can a place hold secrets? Not just stories or memories, but answers sealed off, buried beneath snow and silence. There are corners of the world where something resists explanation, where even the most determined investigations seem to circle endlessly around a void. In these places, questions linger, not because no one has asked them, but because something in the fabric of reality refuses to respond.
Welcome to Down the Crooked Path. I'm your host, Amanda Joy. Join me as we dive into eerie and spine-chilling stories that blur the lines between reality and the unknown. From cryptids and mysterious disappearances to true crime, UFO sightings, and paranormal activity, venture into the unknown and uncover the secrets that lie down the crooked path.
There are events in life and in death that seem to defy resolution. We chase them away year after year, driven by the need to understand what may never be fully understood. The mystery becomes its own kind of truth, one that doesn't offer closure but demands attention. Some stories don't fade with time, they deepen, drawing in new voices, new theories, and still leaving the core untouched. Our universe is vast, filled with phenomenon we've yet to name, forces we've only begun to measure. The disappearance and death of 9 hikers in the Russian wilderness may belong into this category, not forgotten, not solved, but suspended in a space between knowledge and the unknown. And maybe that's where it will remain. The route was mapped through the northern reaches of the Ural Mountains, a region known for its brutal winters and sparse population. The terrain was remote, unforgiving, and largely untouched, stretching across the borders between the Komi Republic and Sverdlovsk Oblast. The hikers were headed towards a mountain called Kholat Sai Aikal, a peak whose name in the local Mansi language translates to something akin to Silent Peak. The area was isolated, with no nearby settlements, and the nearest outposts were days away by foot. Snowfall was heavy, temperatures dropped well below freezing, and visibility could vanish without warning. This was not a place that welcomed visitors. The pass itself was set at an elevation of roughly 780 meters, nestled along the ridges and valleys that twisted through the landscape like a maze. The forest thinned as the group ascended, giving way to open stretches of wind-blasted snow and jagged rock. The silence of this part of the Urals was not peaceful, it was total. No birds, no animals, no movement. Just the sound of the wind carving through the trees and sweeping across the slopes. The deeper one traveled into this region, the more the environment seemed to close in. Not physically, but psychologically. It was a place where direction became uncertain and time felt suspended. The location had no formal name at the time of the hike. It was later designated Dyatlov Pass, but during the expedition, it was simply another stretch of wilderness on its way to Autorten, a mountain further north. The route was classified as a Category 3, the most difficult level of hiking under the Soviet standards, requiring experience in navigating extreme conditions. The group had planned to reach Autorten and return, documenting their journey along the way. The expedition was launched in the final days of January 1959, during one of the harshest stretches of winters in the Soviet Union. At the center of the group was Igor Dyatlov. He was young but experienced, an engineer student with a reputation for discipline and technical skill. Dyatlov had led previous expeditions and was known for his ability to manage linguistics and maintain morale, as well as adapt under pressure. He was methodical in his planning, careful in his selection of equipment, and deliberate in choosing who would join him. This was not a casual outing. It was a sanctioned trek approved by the university's sport club and intended to demonstrate advanced survival and navigation skills in extreme conditions. Dyatlov was not just the leader, he was the architect of the entire operation. The others who joined him were skilled hikers, each with their own background in mountaineering and cold weather travel. They were students and graduates, most from the same institution, and each had completed previous expeditions of similar difficulty. Zinaida Kolmogorova, a 22-year-old, was a student at the Ural Polytech Institute and ranked among the team's most skilled hikers. Her previous expeditions had taken her through similarly harsh conditions. She was known for her resilience and sharp attention to detail. Zinaida had practical mindset and a strong presence, often taking responsibilities that required both endurance and precision. She had completed multiple Category 2 and 3 hikes. Her inclusion in the group was based on more than just familiarity. She had proven herself in the field. She kept a journal like several others and documented the early stages of the journey with a tone that was steady and observant. Her entries noted the weather, the terrain, and the group's progress. Ludmila Dubinia was the youngest member of the group, a student at the Ural Polytech Institute, and had already completed several high-category expeditions. She had faced severe conditions before and had proved her ability to endure them. Dubinia was also known for her determination, her sharp intellect, and her ability to remain composed under pressure. She was methodical in her approach to hiking, and her inclusion in the team reflected both her skill and her reliability. She had a background in civil engineering and was deeply engaged in her studies. Her academic discipline carried over into her fieldwork, where she maintained detailed notes and contributed actively to group planning. Like others on the team, she kept a journal during the expedition. Her entries were direct and observant, noting changes in the weather, terrain, and group's dynamic. Dubinia had trained for this level of difficulty and was familiar with the expeditions of a Category 3 route. Yuri Doroshenko was 21, a 4-year radio engineering student at the Ural Polytech Institute. He was physically strong and known for his boldness during expeditions. On previous hikes, he had once confronted a bear with a geologist hammer, an incident that lingered in the memory of those who knew him. Doroshenko wasn't reckless, but he didn't hesitate when faced with danger. His gear was often less insulated than others, but he compensated with endurance and resolve. He had close ties to several members of the group, including Igor and Zinaida. Although his relationship with her had ended before the hike, they did remain on good terms. Doroshenko had completed multiple high-category treks and was familiar with the demands of the terrain. His inclusion in the team reflected both experience and trust. Alexander Kulivatov was 24, a physics student specializing in nuclear studies. He had transferred to UPI from Moscow and was known for his focus and technical precision. His hiking experience included several difficult expeditions, and he approached each with methodical preparation. He had a reserved demeanor and was respected within the group for his reliability. Kulivatov contributed to planning and execution without drawing attention to himself. His inclusion in the team reflected both his experience and his ability to remain composed under pressure. Rustam Slobodin was 23, a mechanical engineer graduate from the Ural Polytech Institute. He was athletic and experienced in long-distance hiking, and several high-category expeditions were behind him. Slobodin had a calm, disciplined nature and often carried a mandolin on trek, a small personal detail that set him apart. He came from an academic family and was known for his resilience and his confidence. His inclusion in the group was based on proven capability and familiarity with the demands of the route. Yuri Krivonischenko was 23. a construction and hydraulics graduate from the Ural Polytech Institute. He was experienced in high-category hikes and had joined several of Dyatlov's previous expeditions. Known for his humor, he often helped keep morale high during difficult treks. He had worked at the Chelyabinsk 40, a secret nuclear facility, and was familiar with hazardous environments. Yuri was close with other team members and brought both technical skills and camaraderie to the group. Nikolai Tibio-Brignol was 23, a recent graduate of the Ural Polytech Institute with a degree in civil engineering. He was athletic, sharp-minded, and known for his calm demeanor during difficult treks. His hiking experience was extensive. He had served on the Institute's qualifying commissions for expeditions, a role reserved for those who had proven skill and judgment. He came from a family marked by political repression, and his upbringing had installed a quiet resilience. Nikolai had participated in multiple high-category hikes and was familiar with the terrain and conditions they were entering. He was well-liked among the group and contributed to the team with steady focus and physical capability. Simeon Zolotaryov was a 38-year-old. He was the oldest member of the group and the only one not affiliated with the Ural Polytech Institute. He had joined the expedition shortly before its departure, replacing another hiker who had fallen ill. His background was different from the others. He was a military veteran, having served through the entirety of the Great Patriarch War and carried commendations for his service. After the war, he trained as a physical education instructor and had worked at various tourist bases across the Soviet Union. He introduced himself as Sasha, a name that appeared in several documents and personal accounts, though his given name was Simeon. His decision to join Dyatlov's group came through a referral from another hiking team whose itinerary didn't align with his plans. Sasha had intended to visit his mother, and the timing of Dyatlov's expedition suited him better. His presence was accepted without issue. His credibilities were solid, and his experience in extreme conditions was well established. Despite his qualifications, Sasha's inclusion raised questions later. He was older, less familiar with the group, and carried a background that didn't quite match the others. His military past, his sudden change in plans, and the use of an alternate name all contributed to a sense of ambiguity that would linger long after the hike began. The group left Vizhay on January 27, 1959, skis strapped to their packs, the forest closing in behind them as they moved into the deeper reaches of the Ural wilderness. The trail ahead was buried with thick snow. The air was sharp with cold. Temperatures hovered well below freezing, often dipping past -30 Celsius. The wind cut through the trees in long, low gusts, and visibility shifted with each passing hour. The terrain was uneven, dense forest gave way to open tundra, and the slopes of Khao-Lat Saikal loomed in the distance. They followed a planned route, one which had been approved by the university sports club, and documented their progress through journals and photographs. In the earlier days of the hike were steady. The group moved in formation, setting up camp each night and recording their routine. They noted the weather, the conditions of the trail, and the mood within the team. There were moments of fatigue but no signs of distress. The snow deepened as they ascended, and the forest began to thin. Their pace slowed but remained consistent. They were prepared for the conditions, and their equipment reflected the severity of their route. Each member had trained for this level of difficulty, and their coordination suggested experience and familiarity with one another. They were expected to return to Vizhay on February 12th. Dyatlov had arranged to send a telegram upon arrival, a standard protocol for expeditions of this kind. The timeline allowed for delays due to weather, and the group had accounted for that in their planning. Their journals continued to track the journey. Their photographs captured the landscape as it grew more remote. The hike was progressing, and the team remained focused. By mid-February, the expected date of return had passed. The group had planned to send a telegram from the final leg of their route, confirming their arrival and signaling the end of the expedition. But that message never came. Days went by, then a week. At first, the delay was not alarming. The weather in the northern Urals was unpredictable, and it wasn't uncommon for expeditions to run behind schedule. The terrain they were navigating was remote, and communication was limited to a few points of contact they had left behind. Family members began to ask questions. The university sports club, which had approved the route, noted the absence but held off on raising concern. There was still time, still margin for error. But the silence continued. No word from Vizhay, no message from Ott Orton, no sign that the group had reached their destination. Days continued to pass, and the absence began to shift from inconvenience to unease. The search for the Dyatlov group officially began on February 21, 1959, after pressure from family members and mounting concerns at the Ural Polytech Institute. Initial hesitations from officials had caused delayed action. Some believed the hikers were simply held up by weather. But the silence had stretched too long, and the university's sports club could no longer offer reassurance. Volunteers, many of them fellow students, joined the effort alongside military personnel, local authorities, and experienced outdoorsmen. The operation expanded quickly, drawing from multiple search parties and aerial support from Ivydel Airport. The terrain posed immediate challenges. The region around Kalatsayakal was buried beneath deep snow. Visibility was limited, and the winds cut across the slopes in unpredictable bursts. The area was remote with no marked trails and few natural landmarks. The team relied on maps, compasses, and prior knowledge to the route Dyatlov had submitted. The landscape was a mix of dense forest, frozen rivers, and exposed ridgelines. Snowdrifts concealed depressions and altered the shapes of the terrain, making navigation slow and hazardous. Several groups were deployed simultaneously. One team, led by Boris Latslov, was dropped by aircraft near Mount Ott Orton, the intended destination of the Dyatlov group. They found no signs of arrival, no flags, no markers, no evidence that the hikers had reached that point. Other teams moved to the valleys and slopes surrounding Kalatsayakal, scanning for tracks, discarded equipment, or any indication of movement. Local Mansis hunters joined the search, bringing knowledge of the land and its patterns. Prison guards from the nearby Ivydel labor camp were also enlisted, along with officers from the Ministry of Internal Affairs. On February 26, 1959, the search party led by Boris Slotsov and Mikhail Sharavin located the Dyatlov's group tent on the eastern slopes of Kalatsayakal. The discovery was made after spotting a trail of ski tracks partially buried in the snow, which led them to a shallow rise on the mountainside. The tent was found collapsed, partially covered in snow, and positioned at an angle on the slope. It had not been dismantled or packed away. One side was sunken. The fabric was torn open. The damage was not consistent with external forces or weather. Upon closer inspection, it became evidence that the cuts had been made from the inside. The tent had been modified from two standard Soviet hiking tents, stitched together to accommodate a full group. It was familiar to Boris, who had helped construct it years earlier. The entrance flap was closed, but the side facing downhill had multiple slashes, each made with a blade from the interior. The positioning and nature of the cuts suggested a rapid exit. There were no signs of struggle inside, no blood, no indication of an external attack, yet the decision to cut through the fabric rather than use the entrance raised immediate concern. Inside the tent, the group's belongings remained. Blankets, backpacks, cooking equipment, and food supplies were intact. Clothing was scattered, including jackets, boots, and insulated layers. Several pairs of shoes were lined up neatly as if prepared for the next day's hike. A flashlight was found on the top of the tent, still functional. A plate of solo, white pork fat had been left uneaten. Journals and maps were present, undisturbed. The scene did not suggest abandonment due to external threats. It looked as though the group had left in haste, without taking the gear necessary to survive the conditions outside. Footprints led away from the tent, descending the slope in scattered patterns. The tracks were shallow, preserved in the hardened snow. Some were made by bare feet, others by socks or a single boot. The prints indicated movement by at least 8 individuals headed towards the tree line nearly a kilometer downslope. The spacing and depths of the tracks suggested walking, not running. There were no signs of pursuit, no drag marks, no evidence of a coordinated flight. The trail faded as it reached the forest, where the snow was deeper and the terrain more complex. The tent's location was exposed, positioned on open ground with no natural windbreak. It was not the most sheltered site, but it aligned with the group's documented route and schedule. The decision to camp there had likely been made late in the day after failing to reach a more protective area. The slope was steep, the snow accumulation was significant, and the site was photographed and documented by the search team. Measurements were taken, and the area was marked for further examination. No immediate conclusions were drawn. The tent was intact, the gear was present, and the group had left without it. Between February 27th and March 2nd of 1959, the search team began to move deeper into the forested area below the eastern slopes. Following the trail of footprints that had led away from the tent, they descended towards the tree line, where the terrain shifted from open snowfields to dense woodland. Roughly 1.5 kilometers downslope near the forest edge, they came upon a large cedar tree. Its trunk scarred, its lower branches broken, and the snow around it disturbed. At the base of the cedar, the bodies of Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonoshenko were found, both lying near the remains of a small fire which had burned down to ash and charred wood. The area around the fire showed signs of frantic activity. Branches had been snapped from the trees, up to 5 meters high, suggesting one or both of the men had climbed it, possibly to look for the tent or signal for help. The bark was stripped in places, and the snow beneath the tree was packed down, indicating prolonged movement in this area. Doroshenko's body was found closest to the fire. He was wearing only a short-sleeved shirt, cotton underwear, and no shoes. His skin showed signs of frostbite and burn, likely from close contact to the flames. His hair was burned on one side, his hands were bruised and scraped. Krivonoshenko was found a short distance away, also barefoot, dressed in a torn undershirt and light clothing. He too had burns on his legs and hands, along with bruises and abrasions. Both bodies show signs of having struggled to stay warm, and the fire appeared to have been their last attempt at survival. The scene was documented and detailed. The discovery raised immediate concerns and questions. The distance from the tent, the conditions of the bodies, and the evidence of a fire suggested a desperate attempt to survive. Yet the lack of clothing and the injuries were difficult to reconcile with the known conditions. The search continued, expanding outward from the cedar as the investigators began to piece together the final movements of the groups. On March 5th, the search team uncovered a third body. It was found approximately 300 meters from the cedar tree, positioned along the direct line back towards the tent. The body was identified as Igor Dyatlov, the leader of the expedition. His remains were partially buried in snow, lying face up with his head slightly turned to one side. His arms were bent at the elbow, hands clenched near his chest, as if frozen mid-motion. The posture suggested movement, an effort to crawl or shield himself from the cold. Igor was dressed more adequately than the previously two discovered hikers. He wore a fur-lined jacket, a sweater, and thermal layers. His footwear consisted of one left boot and one wool sock. The clothing was insufficient for the conditions, but it was more than what had been found on the Yuris. His watch was stopped at 5:31 a.m., though the exact time of death could not be confirmed. His face showed signs of frostbite and his lips were cracked. There were abrasions on his hands and bruises on his knuckles, consistent with blunt force trauma or defense injury. His right cheekbone was slightly swollen, and there were scratches along his forearms. The location of the body was significant. It laid between the cedar and the tent, suggesting a possible attempt to return to shelter. The terrain in that area was uneven, with snowdrifts reaching up to 1 meter deep. The slope was gradual, but the wind exposure was severe. Searchers noted an absence of any trail markers or equipment nearby, no flashlights, no provisions, no signs of coordinated regrouping. Igor had been alone when he died. The discovery added weight to the timeline. Igor had survived longer than the others found near the cedar. He had moved away from the fire towards the tent and collapsed before reaching it. His injuries were not fatal on their own, but the exposure and exhaustion had taken their toll. The search continued, and the teams expanded their grid across the slopes and into the ravine below. On March 5th, the search team uncovered a fourth body. It was approximately 150 meters away from the remains of Igor, positioned along the same line leading back towards the tent. The body was identified as Zinaida Kolmogorova. She laid face down in the snow, her arms extended forward, one leg slightly bent, as if frozen mid-stride. Her location placed her closer to the tent than Igor, suggesting that she had attempted to return to the shelter as well. Zinaida was dressed in a long-sleeve shirt, 2 sweaters, and ski pants. She wore 2 pairs of socks but no boots. Her clothing was layered but insufficient for the conditions. Her skin showed signs of frostbite, and her face bore multiple injuries. There was bruising on her right cheek and an abrasion across her nose and lips. Her hands were scraped with visible damage to the knuckles, consistent with blunt force trauma or contact with hard surfaces. The injuries were not immediately fatal, but they indicated physical stress and exposure. The snow around her was compacted with no clear signs of struggle. There were no boot prints nearby, no discarded equipment, and no indication that she had been accompanied. Her position, like Igor's, suggested movement towards the tent. In her journal, recovered earlier from the tent, it contained entries of the earlier days of the hike. Her handwriting was steady, her observations detailed. There were no final notes, no indication of distress. Her presence on the expedition had been active and engaged, and her experience as a high-category hiker was well established. The discovery of her body added another piece to the timeline, but the circumstances were still unclear. Later that same day, search teams located a 5th body. It was found approximately 180 meters from Zenaita's, positioned along the same route leading back to the tent. It was the body of Rustam Slobin. He lay face down in the snow, one arm tucked beneath him, the other extended outwards. His legs were slightly apart, his head turned to the side. The posture suggested collapsing during movement, consistent with the pattern seen in the previous recoveries. Rustam was dressed in a long-sleeve shirt, 2 sweaters, and insulated pants. He wore a single left boot on his right foot and multiple layers of socks on the left. His clothing was heavier than that of the others found near the cedar, but still inadequate for the conditions. The temperatures had remained well below freezing, and the wind exposure on the slope was severe. His body showed signs of frostbite, and his skin was discolored from prolonged exposures. The injuries were more pronounced. A fracture was found along the right side of his skull, measuring approximately 6 centimeters in length. There were abrasions on his face, bruises on his arms, and damage to the soft tissue around his knuckles. The pattern of the injuries suggested repeated falls or impacts, possibly caused by disorientation or exhaustion. The skull fracture was significant, but not immediately fatal. It might have contributed to loss of consciousness, but the primary cause of death was determined to be hypothermia. The snow around Rustam was compacted, with no signs of struggle or external interference. No equipment or personal items were found nearby. His position, like Igor and Zenaita, indicated movement towards the tent. With 5 bodies recovered, the search expanded further into the surrounding terrain. The remaining 4 hikers had not yet been found, and the conditions continued to challenge visibility and movement. On May 4th, 1959, more than 2 months after the initial discoveries, the final 4 bodies from the Dyatlov expedition were located. The spring thaw had begun to expose areas previously inaccessible due to deep snow accumulation. The search team probing the terrain near the cedar tree where the Igors had been found identified a depression in the snow leading into the ravine approximately 75 meters further downslope. The area was dense with bush and uneven terrain, partially shielded from the wind and visibility. Within this ravine, concealed beneath 4 meters of compacted snow, the remaining 4 hikers were found. The bodies of Ludmila, Simon, or Sasha, Nikola, and Alexander were discovered together in a shallow stream bed. The location was marked by signs of an improvised shelter, branches arranged in a den-like structure, padded with clothing and remnants of fabric. The construction suggested an attempt to create insulation against the cold. The surrounding area showed evidence of activity: broken tree limbs, disturbed snow, and traces of movement. Unlike the others found earlier, these 4 were dressed more adequately, wearing multiple layers including jackets, hats, and boots. Some of the clothing was later identified belonging to the hikers who had died near the cedar, indicating that garments had been redistributed amongst the survivors. Ludmila's body was positioned closest to the stream. She wore a torn sweater with 2 pairs of pants, one of which belonged to Yuri Krivonishenko. Her injuries were extensive, and she had suffered massive internal chest trauma, multiple fractures on the ribs on both sides with hemorrhaging into the heart and lungs. Her tongue was missing, along with her eyes and portions of soft tissue around the mouth. The damage was not consistent with predatory animals, according to forensic reports, and there were no signs of external wounds that could explain the internal injuries. Her hands were clenched, and her posture suggested that she had died in a state of extreme physical stress. Simon, or Sasha, was found nearby laying face down with his head turned to his side. He wore a fur hat, a military-style jacket, and multiple layers of clothing. His injuries mirrored those of Ludmila, severe chest trauma including multiple fractured ribs and internal bleeding. His body showed no external bruising that could account for the force required to cause such damage. A camera was found strapped to his body, and the film would be later developed. His injuries were described by forensic experts as comparable to those sustained in high-impact accidents, such as a car crash. Nikola was located slightly apart from the others, laying on his side with his head resting against rock. He wore a jacket, thermal layers, and boots. His skull had sustained a massive fracture, an impact wound that extended across the temporal bone and associated with hemorrhaging. The injury was fatal and likely occurred shortly before death. There were no other signs of injuries, and his clothing was intact. The position of his body suggests that he had fallen or collapsed suddenly. Alexander was the last found, partially buried beneath the snow lying close to Ludmila. His injuries were less severe. He had a deformed neck consistent with exposure and postmortem movement, and a minor abrasion on his face. His clothing was layered and included a coat, sweater, and trousers. His body showed signs of early decomposition, likely accelerated by the moisture from the ravine. There was no indication of violent trauma, but the circumstances of his death remained unclear. The discovery of the final 4 bodies deepened the mysteries surrounding the Dyatlov Pass incident. Their location, injuries, and conditions differed markedly from those found earlier. The presence of the shelter, the redistribution of clothing, and the nature of the wounds suggested that these individuals had survived longer and attempted to endure the conditions through coordinated effort. Yet the injuries, particularly the internal trauma, remained unexplained by environmental factors alone. The site was documented extensively. The ravine was marked and the bodies were transported for autopsy and examination. The search concluded with the recovery of all 9 hikers. The terrain had yielded its final secrets. Along with the journal entries, cameras were found among the hikers' belongings. While they offered a little insight into the team's final days, there were some curious photos. The final frames on Yuri Krivonoshenko's camera were unlike others recovered from the Dyatlov group. His roll, designated Film Number 6, contained a series of images that had begun as casual snapshots, interior scenes, portraits, moments of camaraderie, but towards the end the tone shifted. The last frame showed streaks of light against a dark background. They were blurred, uneven, and difficult to interpret. The exposures were inconsistent. The source of light was not identified. The images were taken at night. That was clear from the surrounding darkness and lack of ambient details. The streaks varied in intensity. Some appeared as thin lines and others as broader flares. The direction of the flares were erratic. There was no discernible pattern, no faces, no landscape, no context. Investigators considered multiple possibilities. The most popular explanation was accidental exposure. The camera may have been jostled, the shutter could have been triggered unintentionally, and the film might have been damaged during development. But the timing of the frames and their placement at the end of the roll raised questions. If the exposures were accidental, why were they clustered together? And how were these the final images? Some researchers proposed that the light came from flashlights, others have suggested firelight, and a few have speculated about rare atmospheric phenomenon, including ball lightning. There are also claims of more exotic origins, but those were not supported by physical evidence. The negatives were examined and no tampering was found. The emulsion was intact, and the anomalies were present in the original film. Yuri's camera was one of several recovered. Igor's camera, labeled Film Number 2, contained images of the group's journey, snow-covered trails, campsite preparations, candid moments. Rustam's camera, Film Number 4, had similar content, and Sasha's camera was damaged. It contained 11 frames. Most were unremarkable. One was overexposed, and the subject was unclear. The order in which the bodies were discovered, the condition each was found in, revealed a pattern that was neither linear nor uniform. The first 5 were located within days of each other, scattered between the cedar tree and the tent, suggesting a retreat that was fragmented and desperate. The final 4, buried deep in a ravine, and uncovered only after the spring thaw, had survived longer and appeared to have attempted shelter. Their injuries were more severe, their clothing more complete, and their location more concealed. The contrast between the two groups raised immediate questions about what had unfolded at the slope. The tent itself had been cut open from the inside, not torn or collapsed by external forces. The hikers had fled without boots, without coats, in sub-zero temperatures. Footprints leading away were orderly, not erratic, no signs of running, no evidence of panic. The tracks showed individuals walking calmly through the forest, some barefoot, some without socks, some in only socks. But there were no signs of pursuit, no drag marks, no indication of a coordinated escape. The tent contained food, clothing, and equipment. It had not been abandoned due to lack of resources. The injuries varied widely. Some died of hypothermia consistent with exposure. Others suffered massive internal trauma, fractured ribs, crushed skull, and hemorrhaging, without corresponding external injuries. Ludmila's tongue and eyes were missing. Sasha had a camera that was not listed in the expedition's inventory. Radiation was detected on some of the clothing. The detail did not align with a single cohesive explanation. Theories emerged quickly. An avalanche was proposed, but the slope was not steep enough and the tent had not been buried. The footprints remained visible, which would have been erased by a slide. Military involvement was considered, secret weapon testings, parachute mines, or accidental exposure to classified operations. Some pointed to the hikers' proximity to restricted zones and the presence of unusual injuries. Others speculated about infrasound, a rare atmospheric phenomenon capable of inducing panic and disorientation. There were suggestions of animal attacks, though no tracks or bite marks were found, and more fringe theories included UFOs, paranormal forces, and time anomalies, all fueled by the absence of a definitive cause. The Soviet investigation ultimately concluded that the hikers had died due to a compelling natural force, a phrase that offered little clarity and left considerable room for speculation. Following the incident, the region surrounding Kholat Syakhl was closed to expeditions for 3 years. Despite extensive documentation and forensic analysis, no single theory was able to account for all the evidence. The condition of the tent, the orderly footprints in deep snow, the range and severity of injuries, the missing body parts, the staggered timeline of deaths presented contradictions that resisted a unified explanation. In the decades that followed, researchers, journalists, and independent investigators proposed more than 30 distinct theories. They range from environmental causes such as avalanches, catabolic winds, and infrasound-induced panic, to human-related scenarios including military testing, parachute mines, and accidental encounters with classified operations. Others point to psychological breakdown, radioactive contamination, and even speculative ideas involving cryptids or extraterrestrial interference. Each theory attempts to reconcile the physical evidence with the known behaviors of the group, but none could fully explain the combination of trauma, exposure, and decision-making that led to their deaths. The case remained open, but not in an official status, but in the public's consciousness. The questions persisted, and the mountain has retained its silence. In 2019, the Russian Prosecutor's General Office reopened the Dyatlov case, focusing exclusively on natural causes. After months of fieldwork, archival review, and consultations with geographical experts, the official conclusion was issued. The hikers had died as a result of an avalanche. This marked the first time in 60 years that the government had formally endorsed a specific explanation. The theory centered on the location of the tent, pitched on a slope just below the crest of the mountain. Investigators proposed that a slab of snow destabilized by the group's excavation of the site and compounded by wind and snowfall had broken loose sometime during the night. The weight of the slab may have pressed against the tent, causing the hikers to cut their way out in a panic and flee downslope. The absence of avalanche debris was explained by the nature of the slab avalanches, which can cause minimal surface disruption. The injuries sustained by Ludmila and Sasha were attributed to the force of the snow mass, compressing their chests as they lay in the ravine. In 2021, a study published in Communications, Earth and Environment suggested this hypothesis with computer modeling. Researchers simulated snow conditions and terrain, concluding that the delayed slab release was plausible given the tent's placement and weather patterns recorded in the hikers' journals. The study did not claim to solve the case definitively, but it offered a scientifically grounded scenario that accounted for the sudden evacuation and some of the trauma. Critics of the avalanche theory point to the inconsistencies. The slope's angle was below the typical threshold for slab release. The tent was still partially standing, and the footprints leading away were preserved, conditions unlikely if a full avalanche had occurred. The injuries remained difficult to reconcile with the snow pressure alone and the behavior of the group walking calmly into the forest without gear. It was not a full explanation. Despite these gaps, the avalanche remains the official position of the Russian government. It is the most widely accepted natural explanation, supported by modern modeling and field analysis. Yet even within that framework, questions still exist. Catabolic wind was introduced years later by researchers familiar with polar meteorology. It is a rare and violent phenomenon, dense cold air descending rapidly from high elevations, accelerating as it funnels through valleys and slopes. It can strike without warning, it can flatten tents, and it can disorient even seasoned mountaineers. The Dyatlov group had pitched their tent on an exposed ridge of the mountain. There were no trees, no natural windbreaks. If the catabolic wind swept down that night, it would have hit them with brutal force. The tent could have collapsed inwards, trapping them. In the chaos, they may have had to cut their way out, believing the structure was failing or that suffocation was imminent. They left their tent in a line, not a scramble. That detail remained consistent across all accounts. It suggested a decision, not a reaction. If the wind continued, visibility would have dropped. Communication would have faltered. The cold would have intensified. Reaching the tree line would have been their only option. The catabolic wind theory is grounded in physics, geography, and precedent. Similar events have occurred in Antarctica and Greenland. In 1978, a group of skiers in Sweden abandoned their camp under similar conditions. While they survived, the Dyatlov group did not. Infrasound is a low-frequency sound wave produced by natural forces, such as wind interacting with terrain. Under specific conditions, it can trigger psychological responses in humans: unease, confusion, nausea, and sudden fear. In controlled environments, exposure to infrasound has caused subjects to experience chest pressure and panic without any identifiable external threats. If such a wave were present the night of the Dyatlov incident, it may have induced irrational behavior among the hikers, prompting a coordinated evacuation of the tent despite no visible danger. Ball lightning is a rare electrical phenomenon that appears as a glowing sphere, sometimes hovering, sometimes moving erratically. It has been observed during thunderstorms and can persist for several seconds. Witness accounts describe a range of colors and sizes. Its behavior is unpredictable. In the Dyatlov case, some clothing showed burn damage. Melted snow was noted near the tent. A camera mounted on a tripod suggested the group may have been observing something unusual. Photographs recovered from their cameras included streaks of light with no confirmed source. If ball lightning occurred nearby, it could have caused disorientation or panic. Arctic hysteria, sometimes known in indigenous communities as piblaktak, is a psychological condition associated with extreme cold, isolation, and nutritional stress. Documented symptoms include sudden irrational behavior, screaming, running, and stripping off clothing. It has been observed in both native and non-native individuals under prolonged exposure to harsh polar environments. The Dyatlov group had been in sub-zero conditions for days, with limited food and no contact with the outside world. If one member experienced a psychological break, the others may have responded urgently, leaving the tent to intervene or escape the situation. Each theory reflects on the environmental and psychological pressures present at the slope of the mountain, but none offer a complete explanation. But each contributes to a broader understanding of how extreme conditions can disorientate perception, fracture decision-making, and leave behind a mystery that lasts a lifetime. Animal encounters have been proposed as a possible explanation to the Dyatlov's group's sudden departure from their tent. The region was home to reindeer, wolverine, and bear, all capable of causing alarm, all unpredictable under stress. Wolverines are solitary and aggressive. They are known to attack when cornered or provoked. Their presence at Ural Mountain is documented, although sightings are rare. If a wolverine approached the tent drawn to food or scent, it could have triggered a defense reaction. The hikers may have had to cut their way out to avoid confrontation. The animal may have retreated. The group, exposed and disoriented, may have continued towards the forest without returning. Reindeer are not typically aggressive, but a stampede triggered by noise or weather could have startled the group. The sound of hooves in the dark, the vibration through the snow, and the sudden movement, these could have created confusion. The tent was positioned in an open terrain. There were no barriers, and if a herd passed nearby, the hikers may have fled to avoid being trampled. Bears are more dangerous. They are active in the region, though less so in the winter. A bear disturbed from hibernation or drawn by food could have approached the tent. The scent of provisions, the movement inside, the noise, any of it could have attracted attention. If the hikers saw a bear, panic would be a rational response. Cutting through the tent and escaping without gear may have been the fastest option. But no bear tracks were found. There were no signs of struggle. But the snow had shifted. The evidence may have been erased. None of the recovered bodies showed bite marks or claw wounds. There was no fur around, no droppings. The injuries sustained were all internal, blunt force, consistent with falls and pressure, not consistent with animal attacks. But the absence of direct contact does not rule out the possibility of a threat. The fear of an animal, real or perceived, may have been enough. The tent was intact before it was cut. The hikers left in formation. They did not return. The forest was distant. The cold was severe, and the decision to leave without shoes and coats remains unexplained. Stove used by the group was a collapsible model designed for use inside of a tent. It had been assembled and tested earlier in the expedition. On the night of the incident, the stove was found packed away, with unburnt wood still inside. There were no signs that it had been used, no soot, no smoke damage, no evidence of combustion. That detail ruled out carbon monoxide poisoning as a direct cause. If the stove had malfunctioned, it would have left physical traces, but it didn't. Methanol poisoning was considered due to the presence of alcohol among the group's supplies. A flask of vodka had been recovered from the tent. It was unopened. No other substances were found. The coroner's report noted that 4 of the hikers had alcohol in their systems at the time of death, but the levels were low, not consistent with methanol toxicity. No signs of vomiting, no blindness, no organ failure. So the theory remains speculative. There is no evidence of contaminated alcohol. The region surrounding the Dyatlov Pass is home to several species of wild mushrooms, including Amanita muscaria, known for its psychoactive properties. When dried, it can cause hallucinations, confusion, and erratic behavior. There is no record of the group collecting or consuming mushrooms. No remains were found on the stomach contents. No references appear in the diaries. But accidental ingestion cannot be ruled out entirely. If one member consumed a toxic species, the resulting behavior could have alarmed the others. The decision to leave the tent may have been a response to perceived danger, not an actual threat. Internal conflict has been suggested as a possible trigger for the group's reaction as well. This group included 9 individuals, most of whom were in their 20s. They were experienced, but under stress. The conditions were harsh. The isolation was complete. The diaries recovered from the tent showed no signs of tension, no arguments, no complaints, but psychological strain is difficult to measure post-mortem. If a confrontation occurred, it left no visible trace, no defensive wounds, no blood inside the tent. The footprints leading away were consistent, no divergent, no pursuit. The possibility of criminal or conspiratorial involvement in the Dyatlov Pass incident has persisted for decades. The terrain was remote but not inaccessible. The Ural Mountains were known to host military activity, including weapon testing and classified operations. Hikers were not far from areas used by the Soviet military for experimental launches or radar calibration. Some researchers believe that the group may have inadvertently entered restricted territory. If they witnessed something they weren't meant to see, the consequences could have been immediate. Sasha's background has drawn particular attention. He was older than the others. He joined the group late. He had military training. His tattoos were unusual, not easily explained. His behavior in the days leading up to the incident was described as confident, even secretive. Some theorists have suggested that he may have had a secondary purpose on the expedition. No documentation supports that claim, but the speculation remains. The presence of radiation on some clothing added weight to the technogenic disaster theory. Traces of beta radiation were found on garments belonging to Krivonischenko and Sasha. The levels were elevated, though not lethal. The source was never confirmed. Possibilities include fallout from nearby testing, contamination from previous work environments, and contact with radioactive equipment. Krivonischenko had worked at the nuclear facility. That detail was known. Whether the contamination occurred before or during the expedition is unresolved. Radiosondes are used in Soviet meteorological research. These weather balloons carried instruments to measure atmospheric conditions. Some include radioactive isotypes for tracking. If one of these weather balloons landed near the tent, the hikers may have investigated. If it malfunctioned or released material, exposure could have followed. No physical remains of a balloon were ever recovered. No official records placed one in the area, but the possibility has not been ruled out. The theory involving Gulag escapees or special forces hinges on mistaken identity. Hikers may have encountered individuals fleeing captivity or conducting covert operations. If confrontation occurred, it left no direct evidence, no foreign footprints, no weapons, no signs of struggle inside the tent, but the injuries sustained by some members were severe. The cause remains disputed. Among the recovered clothing, one of them stood out, a bandana. It was not listed on the original Soviet inventory. It did not match the known belongings of any hikers. Mentions of the bandana come from later accounts, independent researchers, and unofficial sources. Its authenticity is uncertain. Some believe it belonged to Sasha, others suggest it was planted. The fabric has not been analyzed, and its origins are currently undetermined. Eyewitness accounts from the region surrounding the Dyatlov Pass include reports of glowing orbs in the sky. These sightings were documented in the weeks before and after the incident. Residents of nearby settlements describe low-moving lights, spherical in shape, hovering just above the horizon. The colors varied: orange, white, sometimes bluish. The orbs were silent. They didn't flicker. They didn't behave like aircraft or flares. The Mansi people indigenous to the area have long reported unusual aerial phenomenon. Their accounts were consistent with the timing of the Dyatlov expedition. Some describe the lights as reoccurring. Others claim they were brightest in the direction of the mountain. Some reports were not formally investigated. They were noted, but then dismissed. Photographs recovered from the hiker's camera show streaks of light against dark backgrounds. The source has never been identified. The exposures were uneven and the angles erratic. One image from inside of the tent showed a flare-like burst. It was overexposed, the subject was unclear, and the frame was the last on the roll. No official examination was given for the lights. No military exercises were confirmed in the area. No aircrafts were logged. The Soviet investigation did not address the eyewitness reports. The files made no mention of aerial anomalies, and the topic was just avoided. Is it possible that what they encountered was a UFO? It would explain the lights, and it would partially explain the radiation. Fringe theories surrounding the Dyatlov Pass incident have circulated for decades, fueled by gaps in the official investigation and the mystery of the hikers' final hours. The ideas often fall outside of the realm of conventional science, yet they continue to circulate in books, documentaries, and online forums. The Yeti theory gained traction in the 1960s, popularized by tabloid headlines and speculative media. It suggested that the group was attacked by a cryptid creature native to the Siberian wilderness. The Yeti theory gained traction in the 1960s, popularized by tabloid headlines and speculative media. It suggested the group was attacked by a cryptid creature native to the Siberian wilderness. Supporters point to the violent injuries sustained by some of the hikers and the remote location of the incident. No physical evidence has ever supported this claim. There are no tracks, no fur, no eyewitnesses. The theory remains unsubstantiated. Time vortex and teleportation experiments belong to the category of speculative physics. These theories propose that the hikers may have encountered a localized distortion of time and space, possibly linked to secret research or natural anomalies. Some versions suggest that the group was transported or displaced, explaining the disarray in the injuries. No scientific basis exists for such phenomenon in the region. No equipment was found, no documentation surfaced, so the idea remains theoretical. Gravity fluctuation theories suggest that the area around the mountain may have experienced a temporary shift in gravitational forces. This could have caused disorientation, imbalance, or even physical trauma. The concept is based on the fringe interpretations of geographical data and reports of strange sensations in the area. No instruments were deployed at the time, no measurements were recorded, and the terrain shows no signs of instability. No fringe theory has ever been confirmed. None have produced verifiable evidence, but their continuance reflects the unresolved nature of the case and the human need to fill silence with possibility. The Dyatlov Pass remains one of the most confounding, unsolved cases of the 20th century. Decades of investigation, speculation, and re-examination have produced dozens of theories, some grounded in science, others in psychology, and still others in the realm of secrecy and the unexplained. Yet none of them fully account for what happened. Each explanation addresses part of the evidence. Environmental theories can explain the decision to leave the tent, but not the injuries. Psychological theories offer insight into the behavior, but not the physical damage. Conspiratorial theories raise questions about the radiation and the missing documentation, but lack direct proof. Even forensic advancements have failed to reconcile the inconsistencies in the timeline, the condition of the bodies, and the state of the campsite. The Soviet investigation was closed with a vague conclusion, a compelling natural force. That phrase has become a placeholder for everything that doesn't add up. The official files contain gaps. Witness statements were omitted, artifacts were either undocumented or lost. Some items like the bandana, the extra camera, were never formally acknowledged. Others were cataloged but never explained. The case remains unresolved because each new theory fails to account for certain elements, resulting in details that do not align, facts that are inconsistent, and lingering unanswered questions. We continue to ask questions, to analyze the situation, to revisit the mountain, not in the pursuit of past experiences, but to address what remains unresolved. Until next time, I'm Amanda Joy. Stay curious, keep asking, and let the mysteries guide you forward. Follow the path further if this episode left you lingering in the shadows. There's more to explore. Follow Down the Crooked Path on TikTok and Instagram for haunting visuals, behind-the-scenes lore, and updates on upcoming episodes. Every post is another breadcrumb deeper into the strange, the forgotten, and the beautifully unsettling. Stay curious and keep walking.